who don't, but
hey,
hello.
We're talking to people other than just ourselves.
Yeah, calling Chris Anderson in. Okay, where?
You mean you can't tell?
I might. I might make a guess.
Well, I am in beautiful downtown Sydney, Nova Scotia.
Sydney.
Yeah.
Where in Nova Scotia is Sydney?
That is on Cape Breton Island. We're not too far from Louisbourg, which I went to the other day, which was awesome.
Oh yeah, isn't that amazing?
Yeah, but I'm happy to point out that Sydney is important because it was founded in 1785 by good, God-fearing, patriotic men and women who were driven from the colonies and set up their loyalist home here in Nova Scotia.
What are they called? There's a United Empire
Loyalists.
Loyalists, right? There you go.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I am in the proper, upright, revolutionary state of Massachusetts today.
Well, that's a good place to be.
In Rockland, Massachusetts. I'm here for a funeral tomorrow morning in nearby Plymouth. Very good friend of mine, Bobby Clark. She was 93 years old. She was a media powerhouse in Chicago. And believe it or not, even at age 93, she was, for the last 25 years, has been a radio reporter in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So just an amazing human being, and with 6 kids. And I'm looking forward to seeing her kids tomorrow and bidding Bobby farewell. So that's what I'm doing here.
And oddly enough, we're in these incredible places, and we both are stuck in hotel rooms that look oddly similar.
Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. Thank you to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for their assistance in bringing you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening in your car to the HHH podcast, welcome. Oh, welcome. Sorry, I'm a little off. I don't have the bell today either. I just want to apologize for that, because this was in a hurry trip.
I understand.
Today we'll be talking about the Declaration of Independence, and I know what a joy that brings to your heart, Chris. Yes. Okay. I want to say thank you to all our Patreon supporters, and you may notice a few empty spots on the list, because I went through, I did an edit, and I think I took out everybody who's fallen off as a top shelf patron. And so if you think you're a top shelf patron and you're not on this list, you might want to check your check online, or if you think it looks okay online on Patreon, you can email us at info@historyhappyhour.net and say, what the heck's going on and where's my name? And we'll be.
And if none of those things are true, then just send us the hat back, because we can use it again.
And anybody else who wants to join, you can go to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. All right, Chris, we're 3 minutes in. Our guest, I can see him getting impatient, so we should give me a cue and we'll start this show. Bing.
Bing.
Bing. Okay.
The bar.
Okay. It came to life in a boarding house in Philadelphia under the hand of Thomas Jefferson, captured the American cause, and lives to this day. And of course, I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence. And our guest today, Michael Auslin, has written a history of the Declaration of Independence that starts with its writing and winds through its long afterlife of 250 years. It's called National Treasure. I think he stole that title. Michael Auslin is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, the Stanford University, and is also a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's the best-selling author of 4 nonfiction books. He is a longtime contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and his writing appears in leading publications, included The Washington Post and The Spectator. Michael, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you for having me, guys.
You may not know. I mean, Cheryl, when she talked to you on Friday, may have told you, Chris and I have a little back and forth about the revolution. You may be picking up on that.
You mean?
I'm starting to sense it. No, she didn't. She didn't clue me in. I think she just wanted to see what the surprise on my face was.
Oh, there you go. Okay. So listen, let's go back to the room. July 1776 in Philadelphia, and all these delegates from all these various colonies who are present have just assented, or most of them have assented to this declaration. So, in that moment, at that time, what did they think of it? What does it mean to them? And do they have any idea of the import that's going to be attached to that document in the centuries to come?
Well, what's fascinating is, given how important it became and how important it is to us, none of them recorded anything about the day, more or less. And so we really don't know if they were turning cartwheels or they were stomping out in disgust. We know that the 2 days before, John Adams thought that that was going to be the big day. Right, that was the day that the Congress actually voted for independence, and he writes home to Abigail right away saying, "This will be the great day in American history, with games and shows and fireworks." The 4th, to be totally honest, it was an administrative task. They had to get it done because they had voted for independence. Now you had to tell the Americans that they were part of this new country. You had to tell the world what you had done, and really you had to get this announcement out because you were going on to the really important things. And the important things included, of course, trying to get aid from France and Spain, and then at some point figuring out how these 13 sovereign now states, formerly colonies, were going to work together. So they were trying to figure out what ultimately became the Articles of Confederation. So the 4th, it was important. They wanted to say it right. But did they think we'd be sitting here talking about it 250 years later, that declaration versus what they had done on the 2nd? I don't think so.
Yeah, and Michael, and given the debate about this document, given the back and forth, given what you just said about sort of their emotion at that moment, what was the reaction amongst the Americans when they found out, oh, by the way, you're the citizen of a new country?
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, we'd been at war for over a year, and the war was not going well. That's the reason we had the declaration, right? We were going to lose the war unless we got aid. But you couldn't get aid unless you were something different than colonies just wanting to become part of the motherland again. You could do that really easily, just lose the war, right? Or stop fighting. So the whole point of the declaration was actually to allow you to move forward on winning the war. And of course, even well into 1775, after Lexington and Concord, there were those who wanted to reconcile, and the Congress actually sent the olive branch petition to the king, and he ignored it. Much later in life, which is what we know about the period, other than the somewhat sparse journal, official journal just of the Congress at the time, comes from letters that were written decades later, right? John Adams is writing Jefferson, and Jefferson's writing Madison, and Adams is writing Pickering and Lee and all these other people. And then they start to talk about what they remember happening, which of course, they had lots of memory lapses, and these are guys in their 80s by then, or 70s, and they're forgetting. But much later, John Adams, of course, writes that sort of famous letter where he says, at independence, only a third of the Americans supported it, a third, the Loyalists, opposed it, and in good American fashion, a third didn't have an opinion. Right? They didn't care which way it went. And so, what people are thinking about as they're hearing the news, we have accounts, mostly of the reading of the Declaration in different cities. We have accounts in Philadelphia, read on July 8th. We have accounts in New York where General Washington has it read to the troops on July 9th. We have accounts from Boston, some in New Hampshire. But the sort of nitty gritty that we would like to know, what were people saying about this? People weren't recording it. First of all, they're in the midst of the war. They were busy. They were getting on with their lives. Many of them, how many were literate, how many were actually able to record their thoughts. So what this was, in many ways, it certainly wasn't a propaganda piece of paper, but it was a piece of paper designed to, first of all, give comfort to the patriots, say, while you're fighting. And Washington understood that. He knew that and wrote that this gives comfort to the army. It was to try to sway some of those undecided. If a third are undecided, we'll bring them over to the right side, and maybe even peel off some of those loyalists. Most of the loyalists, of course, in Boston had already left. They had left in March when the British withdrew, but there were loyalists definitely in New York. There were loyalists in the South. There were loyalists everywhere. And so could you reach them and try to tell them that, this is the cause worth joining. And people forget this was our first Civil War,
Right.
and tens of thousands of loyalists left. Chris, as I know you know, in fact, percentage-wise, more Americans left, American loyalists left during the Revolutionary War than French left during the French Revolution, after the French Revolution. It was a massive number. And in the book, I quote in particular Thomas Hutchinson, the most famous of the loyalists, who winds up in London, and they think they're going to be feted as obviously loyal sons of the empire, sons and daughters of the empire, and upholding the true American spirit. And he writes very, very poignantly from London, "We're a dime a dozen," is what he says. "Nobody cares about us." And of course, he never made it back home, and that was home for all of them.
So you quote in your book Andrew Roberts. Who's
you took that quote
a few times. I knew that this was going to be a question that you were going to bring up, Chris. But you want to go? You want to go ahead?
Yeah. Well, most of this quote from Andrew, he wrote his magisterial biography of George III. I like 3/4 of the quote. So Andrew Roberts says the Declaration of Independence is simultaneously grotesquely hypocritical, illogical, mendacious, and this is the part Rick likes, sublime. Do you care to comment on that? Or,
what is he getting at, and what do you think of it?
I mean, I love that quote so much. I wanted to make it one of my 3 epigrams. It didn't make the final 3 because I thought it felt better in the chapter. I wrote, Andrew's my colleague and a friend, and I wrote him, when I wrote him that I was doing the book, and his instant response with all of his incredible generosity of helping me understand the British side, also immediately wrote, "Oh, so you're doing that traitorous document."
Yeah.
And I love Andrew. What I love even more than the quote, which I do have that entire quote in the book. What I love even more is the fact that essentially 250 years after the fact, by the time of his biography of George III, he once again takes the opportunity to go through the Declaration point by point and show how each of the 27 charges, except for 2, are illegitimate. And I love that. I love that about the Declaration. I love that, that what Andrew does in his biography is what men like John Lind were doing in 1776, which was ignoring all the window dressing, right? The stuff, all men are created equal. We pledge our lives. They didn't care about any of that stuff. It was the 27 charges because they were all lawyers. They were all trained with both a logical and a legal frame of mind. And if you can, what's the right word? Not defeat, delegitimize. What's the word on the charges? If you can not deny them, some D word. Whatever the word, you know what I'm saying.
Okay.
If you can basically show that the charges are wrong and illegitimate and false, then you have undercut dramatically the whole premise upon which Jefferson and the signers and the entire patriot cause was based. So I think Congress understood. Continental Congress understood that Jefferson's charges were also, I don't know if they would say they were mendacious and hypocritical and illogical, but they understood that they were a little over the top. It's not that he played fast and loose with the truth, but what he did would take something that had happened one time in one place and make it a general statement of that this is happening. And of course, Congress took out two of the charges. The slave trade condemnation, which he lays solely at the feet of King George. And
I really can't understand the logic of that, but okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, we can come back to it. And a bitter ad hominem attack on the British people, which I think was partly for 2 reasons. One, because again, you are trying at least to talk to the loyalists, and if you just, it's really, when you read the draft, it's a really harsh attack. And secondly, I think they all understood that should they succeed, because of language, because of tradition and culture and the like, they would still be very close to Britain. Obviously, that's going to be, foremost in the minds of people like Alexander Hamilton. But, so just this sort of burning all the bridges was in the charges was not something that Congress thought was wise. So they took that out. So Andrew, I think, he is getting at a truth of how Jefferson, who was both incredibly logical and incredibly emotional and passionate, approached this document. And things like the slave trade, he had tried to get slaves manumitted in Virginia. He had tried to get the slave trade banned in Virginia. Both of those were failed causes that he laid at the foot of the king. So he's very bitter about these things. But the sublime part is ultimately, how we've all come to see this declaration over time. And I think it's how ultimately Jefferson, even as bitterly angry as he was at the mutilations, as he called it, to his draft, by the end of his life, he asked that it be carved on his grave, his tombstone, his grave. So he understood that what finally came out of Congress on July 4th, after a day and a half of debate, was sublime. It just took him a while to publicly acknowledge it.
I'm not sure who gets to go next, Chris.
Well, Rick, you surrendered the field to me, so I defer to you unless you want.
Well, I'm going to wind up here with a long question, but I'm going to start with a comment from a viewer who says the Declaration of Independence presents a lesson in the art of writing. Thomas Jefferson was one of the smartest men in the colonies when he wrote it, yet other people reviewed his work before it was published. Even Jefferson needed editors. And so I do want you to talk about this a little bit, but as part of that, I mean, how much of this declaration is original to Jefferson? Because, I mean, when you think of the stirring phrases, which you did describe as window dressing a little earlier, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal. But towards the end, we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. These all come from someplace else. This Jefferson didn't dream them all up in a little room on Market Street.
Absolutely. He acknowledges that. And I think that's, in this case, it's part of the genius of, I guess we would, used to say the man meets the moment or something like that. It's also, to me, part of the genius of writing, the art of writing. As I've thought more about it. And so to begin with the sort of, the Joe Friday, just the facts man part of it. Yeah. Jefferson very wisely did not write anything new. And again, in one of these much later letters in life, I think this one was to Madison, I have it in the book. He writes in response to another letter that John Adams wrote to Timothy Pickering. Pickering was a Federalist, hated Jefferson. And by the 18 teens, the Declaration, which had been forgotten for decades, it did its job, and now we were on to the Constitution and other things, was now becoming part of the American consciousness and the political consciousness in a way it hadn't been before. And that's when the debate over, well, who is really responsible for the Declaration suddenly emerges. Nobody had cared before. Jefferson never even tried to take credit for it before. But now, as Americans really seem to care about it, he starts to take credit. And someone like Pickering and the Democratic Republicans, his party, of course, are taking credit for him. And someone like Pickering writes to John Adams, and there's this long, famous colloquy where, Pickering says Jefferson didn't do anything new, and Adams jumps on this and says, no, everything had been. It wasn't an idea in it that hadn't been hackneyed about for 2 years prior, and he's listing all these different places that Jefferson drew from. And then, of course, Pickering, in good political fashion, publishes this private letter. So that forces Jefferson to respond, and he responds. Again, I think he responds to a couple different people, but one's to Madison for sure. And he writes, that's right. He said, I didn't feel that it was any part of my charge to write something that had never been thought or said before. Instead, it was to be an expression of the American mind. Now, from one angle, that is simply the easiest way to write. It wasn't plagiarism, but he took all sorts of ideas that had been floating around from the pulpits, from the assemblies, on the streets, and he put them into a document that Americans would recognize and understand. From the political angle, it was brilliant, because if he had written something new, whatever that might have been, then people would have started arguing about that. They would have started saying, well, what's he talking about? But instead, he took all of these ideas. He took George Mason's Virginia Bill of Rights, which had just come out, and basically shortens it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He takes, he's taking from the English Bill of Rights of 1689. He's taking from his own unpublished yet thought out charges against George that he was writing for a constitution for the state of Virginia before he was forced. He didn't want to go to Pennsylvania. He didn't want to go to Philadelphia. He wanted to be in Williamsburg writing a constitution for Virginia. And instead, he got stuck with doing this thing because Franklin wasn't going to do it. Two other members of the committee, Sherman and Livingston, weren't interested. And Adams has that, again, famous, much later in life recollection where he says, well, I'm hated and obnoxious. You write better than I am. And a Virginian should head all this up. So you write it. The truth is, he was a young guy. The others were older. He wrote very quickly. He probably did it in the space of a week to 10 days. To your readers, your listeners' comment, he sends it to the committee of five. Those men I just mentioned, they do some changes. We know that. We don't know who suggested what, although Jefferson annotates his own draft a little bit later. Quick sidebar, that draft for the first time since the bicentennial will go on display at the Library of Congress on July 3rd. I don't think it's going to be up very long. It's going to be in a new exhibit called These Declarations. I think I forget the name of it. That might be the American Philosophical Society's one. Anyway, July 3rd. If you're near Washington, go and see it. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. This is Jefferson's handwritten, hand-edited, and annotated draft. Now, because he was so angry at the editing that we've been talking about, he gives it to the committee, then he gives it to Congress. Congress cuts about a quarter of it. He then writes out about 5 more copies of his draft, and he sends it to people like Richard Henry Lee and others and James Madison saying, oh, here's what I wrote. Here's what Congress came up with. Obviously mine's better, right? But the one that he himself edited and annotated, that is held by the Library of Congress. It survived, and it's going on display July 3rd. So please go see it if you can. But yeah, this was editing. And the truth is, Congress ultimately, it votes for independence on July 2nd. July 3rd, they go right into a debate on the Declaration by probably the morning of July 4th. Again, they're not writing this down. It's crazy. You'd think they would. They adopt it. They cut about a quarter. They actually do a very good job. They add a few more references to God, which were needed because I think that's how people expected to hear things. This was understood as a covenant. They took out some of those really intemperate phrases. They tightened things up, and they put in Richard Henry Lee's original resolution near the end, which was a very wise move to just make it as clear and as blunt a statement as possible about being free and independent and the rights there too.
So you have a quote in the book. It says, yet the terror in France had revealed how radical democracy could quickly spiral into unrestrained despotism with its guillotine, paving the way for Napoleon. Why had the same not occurred in America? So why?
Well, I don't know if you can ever fully understand why something doesn't happen. I think it's because the American Enlightenment was the British Enlightenment. It was the Scottish and English Enlightenments, which had a few unique features to them. One, and this has been a debate now for a century, almost a century and a half. Who really inspired Jefferson? Once scholars began finally trying to understand the origins and the evolution of the Declaration, as opposed to the Constitution, which we had always been trying to struggle over and understand and debate from a legal perspective, that it came very late to get to the Declaration. Then they're talking about, is it John Locke, in the second treatise, which is what Richard Henry Lee says. Declaration is nothing but the second treatise recapitulated. Gary Wills's famous book from 1978, Inventing America, argues it really wasn't Locke. That was the argument of Carl Becker in the 1920s. What it really was a more communitarian Scottish Enlightenment, Francis Hutchinson and others. So it's really looking at the community and not the individual, whereas Locke's looking at the individual. Regardless of who is right, in the sense that I think in a mind as capacious as Jefferson's and often as contradictory as Jefferson's and undoubtedly as complex as Jefferson's, all of these strands are interweaving. It's like the double helix in the DNA. It's unfolding and folding and weaving together. Most of what influenced them was this British Enlightenment from both the English and Scottish sides, which did focus on the individual, but it also focused very heavily on the Bible, a Judeo-Christian base interpreted through a Protestant frame that put limits to what man can do. Because there is God, whether Jefferson's God of nature, nature's God, or the Old Testament God, that you could not, as Thomas Paine said, start the world anew. And that's something that the French Enlightenment did not have. The philosophers were far more radical, even and in part because they were rebelling against the Catholic Church. Right? You didn't have the Catholic Church in England, and so the English and Scottish Enlightenments, as they developed, there were certainly radical strains to those. But in general, it wasn't the same socioeconomic, socio-political environment in which the philosophers' whole, their whole mission was not just against the monarchy; it was against the church. And so there was a moderateness to the ideas that had been inherited, and that was combined with the fact that by the point of the revolution, almost 170 years, 160 years of self-government had been developing on this continent in different ways in each of the different colonies. But self-government starting in 1619 in Jamestown, when the first elected committee, what we would call an assembly, came forth. And so there had been generations of interpreting and working with and developing English common law in the specific circumstances of the colonies. And so in many ways, I think, Jefferson, as radical as some people made him out to be, they didn't see themselves as revolutionaries. In many ways, they saw themselves as conservators. They were conservative.
Yeah, you say that this is a conservative document, not a.
I think it's very conservative. It's like that line from The Leopard, right? Everything has to change in order that everything can stay the same. The most important thing was keeping their liberties, what they called their unwritten constitutions, their assemblies, their laws, their administrative and judicial processes, safe from what they saw as incursion by the king, a vast conspiracy to take away their rights. That was the king and his ministers in parliament. But in order to do that, they were forced ultimately to change everything, which was to do this unprecedented, just nobody had ever conceived. You break away and form a country. Nations were or they weren't. No one had started one. I mean, there had been republics, but nothing like this. And so I think in many ways they were very conservative, and they talked about conservatism. And the tragic recent passing of Gordon Wood, his great insight into this period is that what happened after the revolution was the radicalization, as he calls it, of the American Revolution, far beyond what the founding fathers, what the signers anticipated, and certainly for many of them intended, which was more of a social leveling and a political leveling than certainly people like Washington was comfortable with. So in many ways, I think they were conservative, but that conservatism, whether or not it ultimately had to be superseded by what was happening in the country afterwards, I think that's what kept it from flying off the rails the way that the French did.
So I want to remind everybody that we are chatting today with Michael Auslin, who is the author of National Treasure: How the Declaration of Independence Made America. I'm going to change the topic a little bit. We're going to stay on the Declaration. I mean, it's okay. But an important character in the early life of the Declaration of Independence is somebody who I really had never, maybe I'd heard of him, but never really been conscious of him, John Thompson. Can you tell us about him and his role, both in the Congress and his role as kind of a protector in the first 20 years of the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, Charles Thompson, by the
Charles
way.
Thompson, sorry.
Yeah, Charles Thompson.
See, that's
okay.
yeah.
He is one of the forgotten founders, and he's forgotten because he was the Secretary of Congress, which people sort of say, oh, okay, he's the Secretary. Well, when Congress had almost no staff, which was really Thompson and a clerk or two, he was today, when you think about the staffs of Congress and the executive department, he was all of that rolled into one. He was incredibly powerful, and he was the Secretary of Congress from 1774 until 1789, when the Confederation, the Continental and then Confederation Congress were superseded by the Federal Congress, and then all of the papers of Congress, essentially, including the Declaration, and the journals and all that was turned over to the Department of State. We think of it today as a foreign affairs body, which it is, but back then it was what combined all of the duties of essentially running the country. And so for 13 years and more, Charles Thompson was incredibly powerful, guiding the debates. John Hancock is presiding over the Second Continental Congress, meets in 1775 after Lexington and Concord. But Charles Thompson is the guy who keeps it going day after day, and he's also keeping records. He's keeping scraps of paper, including the scraps of paper such as Richard Henry Lee's original resolution, which you can see in the National Archives, or the actual tally vote on July 2nd, sorry, for independence, and voted by state, right? It's not colony, it's not voted by individual. So there's 12 actually, because New York had to abstain. They didn't get instructions in time, but you can see that all of that was kept by Charles Thompson. He's a controversial figure. He ran afoul of different political factions. He was an ally of Robert Morris in Pennsylvania, who the financier of the revolution, and also ran afoul of different groups. There are those who charge that he actually destroyed certain documents that he didn't want people to see and to know. And therefore, he is culpable in some way for having skewed what the historical record showed. And it was he primarily who wrote out the journals of Congress. So when you go and you can see these original handwritten journals, he kept multiple journals. He kept what was called a rough journal. That was the daily journal. And he kept what was called a secret journal. And that actually was not published until the 1820s. And then he turned the rough journal into a what was ready for publication and supervised the publishing. And then possibly most tragically, he wrote his own history of the real story of the Continental Congress and the Confederation Congress, because what we got from the journals was not as much. We got what was done and less of what was said. It didn't capture a lot of the debates. It didn't capture the thoughts. It certainly didn't, seek out people and say, "Well, what did you think?" or this or that. It was, it was an administrative record, but he wrote the real story, and the hagiography that attends today, but also even back then, the Continental Congress, even though people understood that these were vain, irascible, difficult, scheming men, they still were men of genius and vision and did incredible things. Well, Thompson wrote, what would we call it? The inside scoop. He was the Woodward and Bernstein combined of his day, and then he burned it, and before it was published, and he said it wasn't for him to destroy what people thought about the Congress and to tell the real story, but apparently from the scraps of recollections of what he was writing that have come down to us, he really told about all of the factionalism, the double dealing, just everything that was going on politically. It was like Alan Drury on steroids, right? This was like the real deal. So he's and he was forgotten. He's also one of the longest lived, by the way, of the founders. He lived into, I think it was 1829. I have to just look back at the date. And when he did not get the position he wanted in 1789, he wanted to become the new Secretary of the Senate, because he thought the Senate would be the really important body to continue, sort of shaping what was happening. And again, this is a guy who'd been at the center for 13, 14 years. He was denied that position. It's one of the early lessons of politics in what ultimately becomes Washington, D.C., though at that point, I think he was still in New York. And he retires, and he goes off and becomes a Bible translator. It's an incredible. No one's ever written a biography of him, by the way. He's an incredibly important person, and whether that's because he didn't leave any of his own papers, I don't know. I'd have to go check. I only ran across really one really serious scholarly article on him, and I think that was done in the 70s. I mean, this is one of the great. By the way, Charles Thompson. He was known Charlie Thompson. Somebody was a good time Charlie or something. Charles Thompson was the one that that the Congress sent to Mount Vernon to tell George Washington that he was elected president of the United States in 1789, or probably 88 is when he told him, 88, 89. This was not a clerk.
Yeah.
This was one of the key figures of the revolution, and we still know so little about him.
So, Michael, I guess maybe this is going to be a big question, but one of kind of a two-parter. The first part is, given America's emphasis on individualism and given kind of the state of things after the Declaration, how you said it was sort of it was an administrative thing in a lot of ways. The Constitution, you would think, would have had a much more resonance, right, and be the thing that people kind of look up to and whatnot, and that doesn't seem to be the case. So I guess that's sort of the jump-off point for the second part of my question, which is, let's start the process of where the Declaration starts to become something more and how it's used for, to reflect its times, how this document goes forward. And the Constitution, while important, it doesn't seem to have the same kind of bang in the public consciousness, I think.
You're saying the Constitution doesn't have the bang.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, because in many ways, all of the arguments are constitutional questions that develop over time, obviously even till today. And that's how the system, it's not how it was envisioned in 1776, because they didn't have the Constitution. They didn't think about it. But ultimately, that's how they envisioned the Constitution. The Declaration explicitly was written not to be a governing paper, right? It gives no indication as to what type of government should be set up. I think it actually does through the charges. When you read the charges, which no one reads today, but we should, because they're quite interesting, and there's still some resonances there, here and there. The charges tell us how a just government should not act, and therefore, by implication, how a just government should act. And so even though it's not setting up government, it is clearly pointing the way towards the type of government that the signers felt was legitimate, and ultimately we would get there. But it is a statement that does its job on July 4th, and then it's off to other things. There were two other committees appointed on June 11th, along with the committee to draft the Declaration. One's to draft a model treaty, so you can go right into diplomatic affairs, and the other is Articles of Confederation, which take a much longer time. So it's get it done and move on to these other things. And when you look at newspapers, when you look at accounts, you look at celebrations of the 4th in the succeeding decades, independence is certainly celebrated, but the Declaration is barely mentioned. It is mentioned occasionally and in certain cases, but for the most part, it's not an object of interest. The Constitution, by contrast, especially because you have George Washington presiding, and it is now setting up this new and dramatically different government where there is another split, but this time it's really a domestic split, because we are a country, versus the split in 76, loyalist patriots, is, well, are we going to become a country or not? Whereas in 87 to 89, we are a country. And so the Federalist, anti-Federalist debates are major. They threaten to split apart the country in a way that 76 really didn't, because the loyalists were just not part of the Continental Congress. They had absented themselves. But in 87 to 89, you have all of the leaders of the country, and some who were fervent patriots in 76, like Patrick Henry, against the Constitution. And so there is enormous focus on this Constitution and, the threats from it. And obviously that's why you have to have the Bill of Rights that James Madison initially doesn't want, but then comes around to understanding that this is critical. I think it's always in the forefront of the American mind now that this is the path that you have to go down in order to, maintain a free and independent self-governing country. Whereas the Declaration, you're not going to amend it. You're not going to repeal it. It's done its job. So when does it become popular? Well, interestingly, and again, this is why I spend a lot of time on the cultural history of the document. It becomes popular after the War of 1812 for two reasons. First is that we win, and there's this flush of patriotism post 1815. And we beat the British again, second time in a generation. We're a legit country. We're a going concern, right? That's number one. And so all of the things of 76 get sort of swept up into that. All of a sudden, people are proud again, because we were seen as weak. We felt we were weak. There's a lot of questions in 1812. The country almost split over the War of 1812. People forget that. There was almost a secession of states out of the Union. And those were the New England states, not the Southern states. The New England states didn't want the war. And in fact, they talked briefly about secession in New Hartford. And this was a very fraught moment, but we win. And so everything in 76 seems legitimated. But then even better, the story gets out that in August of 1814, when the Redcoats march in and in a war crime burn Washington, burn the Capitol, burn the White House, the Declaration of Independence is miraculously saved, along with the Constitution and the Journals of the Continental Congress and Washington's Commission, George Washington's Commission, and the like. And people say, that's great. The story gets out. They say, that's great. And then they say, what was saved? Because until that moment, very few Americans knew that there was this beautiful, huge, elegantly written, signed document that was the birth certificate of the United States. That, to our previous point about Charles Thompson, was a paper of state that Charles Thompson kept rolled up with all his other papers of state. Now, the Declaration itself, of course, had been printed and reprinted in both broadsides and newspapers and collections of documents. Even by that time, comes out pretty early. People knew the Declaration, of course, it had been read to them, but nobody knew that this parchment existed, that this parchment had been signed by John Hancock and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So they become fascinated with it. First, that it survived, by the skin of its teeth. And secondly, what is it? So within a few years, artistic reproductions of the Declaration begin to appear. And they're not accurate facsimiles like the one you see over my shoulder in the middle. That is the famous stone engraving from 1823, which comes pretty soon after this period, the sort of capstone. But they're more artistic reproductions. But what they often do, almost always do, is faithfully reproduce the signatures. And Americans got fascinated with the signatures. They'd never seen the signatures. So now there's this piece of paper. They want to know what it is. So these artistic reproductions come about. In 1820, John Quincy Adams, who is the Secretary of State, says that real parchment that was saved just less than 10 years ago is falling apart. It's probably not going to survive. So we need the most accurate, essentially a photograph, which they don't have, right? The most accurate representation of it. And that's what you see over the middle behind me. That's the stone engraving. Took 3 years to do. And that is the iconic image. Whenever you get one of those crinkly copies or you see the handwritten copy, it comes from the stone engraving. And guys, another plug / sidebar, the original copper plate that William J. Stone engraved has been refurbished. It is now on display in the National Archives in an exhibit called The American Story. It's wonderful. And next to it is one of the original printings from it on parchment that was donated by David Rubenstein. So you can see the two together. So once again, another reason to go to Washington. And at this same time that these reproductions are coming out, and soon that stone engraving is the John Trumbull painting. And so you have this moment where the iconography of the Declaration suddenly bursts into the American consciousness. And of course, people misunderstand Trumbull's painting, which you're looking at right now. Most people think it represents July 4th and the signing of the Declaration, whereas it is meant to represent June 28th and the presentation of Jefferson's draft to Congress. But that is, of course, a completely fanciful scene because Congress was, number one, on recess. They were not lined up, number two, and all sitting there like wise sages. The whole committee was not there presenting this. Franklin had the gout. The others were off doing other things. But this became, and by the way, the room is completely historically inaccurate, but this became the iconic image of the moment of the birth of the United States, and people loved it. Trumbull made the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars by exhibiting this up and down the coast, the East Coast, before it was installed in the Capitol in the 1820s. And then he began immediately selling engravings of it. So people could buy engravings of the Declaration, fanciful engravings. They couldn't buy the stone, that came later, but they could buy fanciful engravings, often with little cartouche images of the founders, including George Washington, who didn't sign it. And surrounded by eagles and flags. And it was beautifully done pieces. And if you'd like to see some of those, by the way, you can see them in Philadelphia at the American Philosophical Society. Has a wonderful exhibit on the Declaration. I think that one is called These Declarations. And they have a number of these reproductions that you can go see. Or a little bit more south at the University of Virginia, has an incredible permanent exhibit. It's been up for several decades now. The Albert H. Small Declaration of Independence collection also has these, along with original broadsides from July 4th. So you can go and see these things. But that, Chris, to your question, is when and how the Declaration suddenly burst into the American consciousness. And quite frankly, it's never left it since.
So in addition to the kind of the intellectual history of the Declaration, your book is also a physical history of the document. You touched on that a little bit there in your answer about what happened to this document through the years, where it was during wars, etc. I was wondering how hard that was to research, and if you discovered anything surprising in that quest.
Oh my gosh, yes. So in the book, I talk about 3 declarations. The first is the relic that you're asking about, the physical, and primarily the parchment. But I also talk about different types of printings of it. The second is the symbol, which we've talked about. Why it became the great statement of the American ideal. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the third is the cultural object, and that's what we were just sort of talking about, these different representations and paintings, and why we put it on baseball caps and T-shirts, and they stamped it on medallions and plates and scarves. Nobody had ever written about the third declaration, really. Nobody had ever taken seriously the cultural elements of it, which I think are critical. And again, you see 3 examples of it over my shoulder. Why do we hang it on our wall? And Chris asked earlier, he said, why didn't the Constitution have the same bang? And, in part because it's an incredible but dry legal document. It's also 4 pages long, whereas here's 1 page with all these signatures and beautifully written and bold. And so that's one of the reasons that we hang it on our walls, and we've been doing so for 200 years. If you buy that crinkly copy for your kids this summer at the National Archives, you're doing something Americans have done for 200 years. But the first declaration, to your question, Rick, is one that the archivists and conservators have written about endlessly, not keeping it a secret, but mostly writing to themselves in professional journals or their own administrative histories or the like, telling how we kept this document, we saved it from the hand of time, and it is still a fascinating story. And that's where I began the book. I began the book at the National Archives, looking at the Declaration, realizing I didn't know much about it. I wanted to read a book on it, and there wasn't the book that I wanted to read. But I started there with the conservators, and they're telling me about how this document, how it was saved, and the fact is, it's a miracle it survived. And so it's an adventure story, being saved in 1814, that parchment, being subjected to terrible treatment, not because people were mistreating it, just because they didn't know how to treat it well, and everyone was trying to do the right thing. So when they went to hang it up the first time, here's something that surprised me. They went to display it for the first time, and nobody ever displayed historical documents. They just sat in musty archives. Well, Daniel Webster in 1841 says, let's hang this up in the new National Museum in the Patent Office, which is now the National Portrait Gallery. And so they sewed it to a backing so they could hang it up. And if you look very carefully along some of the sides, you can see the holes where they sewed it because it was animal parchment. And then in 1924, when it was put into its beautiful marble shrine in the Library of Congress, they glued it to a backing, a cardboard backing, glued it. And all that glue eventually had to be scraped off. I mean, they just didn't know how to treat the document. And so a big chunk of the book is actually tracing all of this. And I found it utterly fascinating, the ways in which we were learning and making terrible mistakes step by step. And yet at really critical moments like the 1880s, when there were these ideas that we were going to basically wash the document in acid to bring out the to bring out the ink, we could have taken just the wrong step and it would have been gone forever. And they were very conservative and didn't. And so all of that I really found fascinating. There are some what I call forensically new things in the book. I'll just tell you one. I could talk about it forever because I get really excited because my archivist friends get excited. If you go today and you look, you don't have to look too carefully because it's pretty big. There is a big handprint on the Declaration in the lower left-hand corner. And to this day, the archivists go crazy over that. Where did that come from? Who in the world would have put an oily, dirty, messy hand on the Declaration? We know it wasn't there in originally they had a picture of it taken in 1903 before it was sealed away for a couple of decades to try to preserve it. There's no handprint. And then in 1942, when it is taken out at Fort Knox, it's secretly rushed to Fort Knox during World War II to be protected. That's when they do the first conservation. The handprint is there. So originally there was this 40-year period. Like, how did this handprint get there? Well, I discovered a photograph that had been in the Library of Congress for decades, but no one apparently had ever looked at it, that was taken in the Department of State when the document was there before going to the Library of Congress, taken in 1912, and there's no handprint. And then we went and we blew up pictures of the enshrinement of the Declaration in 1924, and right afterwards when it's put in the shrine, and there's a handprint. So I was able to shrink the period of time that the handprint appeared to basically 12 years. And the National Archives now accepts this. And I'm really happy about that because it's just this small piece of information. We still don't know how it got there. In the book, I give some thoughts and ideas, but discovering that even as late as the 1920s, damage was still happening to the document is fascinating to me. And the truth is that the first real scientific preservation of the document did not occur until 1951, when it was put in the first of its really technologically advanced cases. And it's only been in two cases, 1951 to 2001, and then 2001 to today. And so when you think about it, 1951, it was already 175 years old. It's sort of a miracle that the parchment survived until then, just because of time, because of mistakes, because of people not knowing better, and because of it barely escaped fire several times, obviously escaped the British. And tracing that physical history to me was so much fun and so fascinating, because that's ultimately what we see when we go to the National Archives. We look at that piece of parchment that John Hancock signed so boldly, and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and all the rest. And by all rights, it really shouldn't be here today.
I think it's somebody with a pastrami sandwich. He's got to pick it up. He's like doing one of these things.
Believe me, the archivists, I'm not kidding. The archivists want to draw fingerprints. They want to fingerprint the handprint just in case there's a record somewhere and they haven't gotten permission. But this drives them crazy.
Right.
It's Nicolas Cage's grandfather.
I'm telling you, I'm telling you, there is no treasure map on the back. I can tell you that for sure. Yeah, I know. And by the way, the title does not come from the movie. Sorry to burst your bubbles.
Okay.
It doesn't come from the movie. I couldn't even get Simon & Schuster to get Nick Cage to narrate the audiobook. I tried. I begged them. I started with Cage, and I was like, what about John Voight? What about Bruce Greenwood, who was in National Treasure 2? I love all those guys. They wouldn't do it. The title actually comes from the time that I spent working and living in Japan and studying Japan, where the government designates the most important historical artifacts as national treasures. And those are usually, exhibited maybe once a year. And when they're brought out, it's announced in the newspapers, and there's huge lines, and I would go rush and see them. And I thought, that's pretty great. Like we should do that here. And if we did, then I thought the national treasure would be would be the Declaration. So as much as I love the movies, which I
What
do,
a lucky coincidence.
I love the movies. I absolutely love them. If I could get a copy to Nick Cage, I would. But the title really was coming from a
Anybody
much
who
more
knows Nick
respectable
Cage,
approach.
get this to him, right?
Yeah,
So,
please.
Chris,
I will
give
get
us-
you the copy.
we have time for one more.
All
You
right.
can
So
give us-
okay, this is, I mean, unfortunately, of course, we ran out of time, and there's so much in this book, and it's fascinating. You see the uses that the Declaration has put to, and the arguments, and really, I encourage
the arguments during the Civil War, all it's North,
yeah.
South, British, everybody.
Yeah. But, when I first was reading the introduction of the book, you talk about kind of a little bit about your background, and you say, you're primarily 19th century historian, and you're really interested in what's happening in Asia. But there's something about this story that drew you into it. And I know very broad, and I apologize, but why is this a living document as opposed to it's just another, we took care of that. We're independent now. Let's move on. This, you talk about it in great detail in the book, but this takes on a life of its own, right?
I think the greatness of the Declaration is that it has become the touchstone for everything we think about in terms of being an American, that it silences on women, blacks, American Indians in 1776 were filled later by those precisely who saw in it their claim to be fully American. Whether it's Frederick Douglass or Susan B. Anthony or the Cherokee Nation or whoever is appealing to it, and that to me is proof of the greatness of the document, that it wasn't written at just one point for one reason, and that's something Abraham Lincoln recognized, where he said all hail basically to Thomas Jefferson, who put a permanent stumbling block against tyranny in the future by making this an eternal document. And when we talk about our constitutional struggles, which we are supposed to have in our system, essentially every battle, every issue behind all of them is the spirit of the Declaration. Whether it's civil rights or obviously abolition or the like. It appealed to immigrants coming from all around the world. They translated it, and I have those examples of those translations in the book. They embraced it. This, to me, is why it is a living document. It is our great document of aspiration. If the Constitution tells us how we will live in a political community, the Declaration tells us how we should want to live in a political community. And if anything, I think even at a time with great division and maybe not as strong civics education and historical education, I think its appeal is stronger than ever. And as you walk around today and you see people wearing it, on the baseball caps and the T-shirts and the posters and the like, does it mean they're always thinking about John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and Francis? No, but does it mean that it draws them in some way? Yes, I think it does. And those phrases are eternal, and we can still debate them, but they are on our lips and they're in our hearts. I think it is the most living of our documents.
Michael Auslin, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. And Michael's book is called National Treasure, not taken from the movie, How the Declaration of Independence Made America. Michael, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Very much.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to drop you off here, but stay on. We'll say goodbye to you off the air, but so hang in, but we're going to say goodbye to you on the air right now. Okay, thank you. Okay, and we cut him off. Okay, brilliant. So next week, we were originally planning a live episode, but life got in the way.
Yes.
So we'll reschedule that author, and we will replay our interview with Saul David and his book, Tunis. No, not that one, Rick. Tunis Grad, Victory in Africa. And Saul has been on the show a couple of times, terrific historian, and this was a really interesting interview about the fight in North Africa, which I think still, even though many books have been written about it, is an under-known part of World War II.
Yes.
So, and then we'll be back in 2 weeks with on July 5th with Brooke Barbier talking about
Talking more lies and sedition about
cocked
the War of
and boozy.
Independence,
Well, it's had basically alcohol fueled the American Revolution.
which is somehow appropriate for the show.
You might find that believable. Yeah. So, hey guys, thanks everybody for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.